Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of the Pick Six. I'm your host, Mike Wobschall at TCO Performance Center in Eagan. The offseason is rolling along for the Vikings as they look ahead to 2019, and that's what your questions are talking about. What is in store for the Vikings next season and this offseason? So let's get to work. Question number one comes from Eric in Austin, Minnesota. With the struggles of the offensive line, do you think we would finally take an offensive lineman in the first round? Well, Eric, I think that's a strong possibility for the Vikings in the draft in a couple of months. That's not the only position to watch for the Vikings when it comes to the first round. Who could blame the Vikings for taking a stud in the front seven? We saw teams in the wild card round of the playoffs this weekend with really good players in their front seven advancing. So offensive line, a need for the Vikings, but not the only need to watch in the first round. Question number two comes from Corey, Dallas, Texas. Looking back now on a full season, how do you think the Vikings rookie class did? Well, I think it was a pretty good year for the Vikings rookie class. Mike Hughes' season obviously was cut short, but he looks promising. Brian O'Neill started 11 games along the offensive line, and he looks to be part of the future for the Vikings O-line. Tyler Conklin played a little bit as well and looked good when he was on the field, but maybe the biggest surprise for a lot of people was cornerback Holton Hill, who had to play quite a bit on defense in 2018. His future looks bright as well. A lot of other undrafted players for the Vikings made the roster and contributed, and they will be names to watch this offseason. The next question comes from John in Baxter, Minnesota. What did we learn from watching the wild card round of the playoffs? Definitely some upsets, and I feel inspired for our team to be playing in the playoffs next year. I agree with you, John. Here's one thing I noticed in the wild card round, and this happens quite a bit, especially when underdogs win. Low-scoring games where defense matters. Average total points in the wild card round per game, 36. So it was important for teams to play good defense. Let's not lose sight of that this offseason as everyone focuses on the Vikings offensive coordinator and offensive line. Speaking of the offensive line, the Indianapolis Colts won a playoff game. They had one of the worst offensive lines last season. They invested a first and second round pick in that offensive line last offseason, and look what happened. Their offensive line improved quickly. I think the Vikings can follow the same formula. The next question comes from Nick in Denver, Colorado. Everyone thinks the O-line needs to be addressed, but what other positions do you feel could be upgraded in 2019? Well, head coach Mike Zimmer said every position could use an upgrade in 2019, so I wouldn't rule anything out. But a few things to watch: tight end and or wide receiver, definitely a couple of positions that could be addressed. Could the Vikings find an answer at WR3? That could happen this offseason. How about a punt returner? Marcus Sherrills obviously will be in the running for that job, but if he can't do it, might the Vikings draft a punt returner? Maybe another young safety to pair with Harrison Smith and learn behind Anthony Harris and Andrew Sendejo. And lastly, you can never have enough depth in the trenches. So along with the offensive line, don't be surprised if the Vikings take a look at some defensive linemen in the draft. The next question comes from Dan in New York. What is the team going to do with Anthony Barr? He is a great player, and I feel he is a need for this team to continue to keep its defense in place. No doubt about it, Anthony Barr is a special player. In Mike Zimmer's defense, there's three ways this can go. The Vikings could re-sign Anthony to a long-term contract extension. That would be ideal. If the Vikings can't do that, but they want to keep Anthony, they can use the franchise tag on him and retain his rights for the 2019 season. And then the last option would be he hits the free agent market. And at that point, any team can sign him, including the Vikings, re-signing him. Our final question comes from Dennis in Scottsdale, Arizona. Why do the Vikings continue to make big mistakes to try and get to the big dance? Why do they not try to build through the draft? Well, I'm confused a little bit about that, Dennis. I think your question is referring to Kirk Cousins. The Vikings' investment in Cousins didn't work out from making the playoffs standpoint, but let's remember, Kirk threw for 4,200 yards and 30 touchdowns while being sacked 40 times. If the Vikings can improve their pass protection, I think Kirk's numbers will be even better. But let's not confuse the Vikings with a team that doesn't build through the draft. Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter up front on defense, drafted by the Vikings. Barr and Kendricks, both drafted by the Vikings. How about at corner? Xavier Rhodes and Trey Waynes, drafted by the Vikings. Mackenzie Alexander took a big step in 2018. He was drafted by the Vikings. Harrison Smith, Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook, Pat Elflein, Brian O'Neill, all core members of the Vikings who will be with this team for for a number of seasons in the future, all of them drafted by the Vikings. So I think one thing Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer have worked very well together on in their time together here in Minnesota is building through the draft. That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Pick Six. We'll be back next week, so please submit your questions to the email address at the bottom of the screen, and maybe we'll see you in next week's Pick Six.